Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Connected by Glass. I'm Troy Smythe, Education Interpretation Supervisor for the Corning Museum of Glass. I've taken to referring to today's episode as Hidden in Plain Sight. Every object in the museum's collection has many stories to tell, but often the dominant cultural norms active at the time of manufacture mean some of those stories can be difficult to uncover. That's the case with a set of wine glasses made 200 years ago that we're going to look at today. These glasses use subtle codes and signals to allow queer people at the time to communicate and connect with one another. It's a practice that continues to this day, presenting us with a great opportunity to discuss the role visual code plays in the life of queer people from our time. Our panel is well equipped to delve into this multifaceted topic. I'd like to introduce Anna Laméris, art historian and glass expert, co-owner of Frides Laméris Art and Antiques Amsterdam, and fellow of the Corning Museum of Glass. Andy Campbell, art historian, curator, art critic, and professor of critical studies at the University of California, Roski School of Art and Design. And Kit Maxwell, curator of early modern glass here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So Kit, let's start with you. At first glance, this looks like other diamond point cut goblets the museum has in its collection. Tell us what's unique about this one.
Hi. Well, yes, as you say, this is a wine glass, and it was made in the Netherlands in around 1800s. And I'll just offer a very brief visual description of it. And it's the shape and size we would all recognize as a wine glass today. It's about 17 centimeters high. It has a bowl on a long stem and a circular foot. It's made of lead glass, which is sometimes known as lead crystal. And the high proportion of lead oxide enables this glass to be cut. It makes it a little softer, prevents it from shattering or cracking when it's cut. And you can see that the stem is cut into many, many facets like a diamond, so it would sparkle in the candlelight. But the softness of the glass also enabled it to be engraved. And the bowl of this wine glass has engraving using the diamond point technique, whereby quite literally the tip of a diamond is tapped onto the glass and a design emerges out of thousands of individual dots. The scene on this engraving, though, is, as you say, particularly interesting. It depicts two women in flowing robes, and they are seated on a bench. Their adjacent arms are entwined and their hands are clasped, and they're looking rather intently at one another. With their free arms, with their spare arms, one woman is tending to a smouldering altar, and the other is holding a flaming heart. And beneath them is a banderole or banner with the word vriendschap, which is Dutch, or my attempt at Dutch, for friendship. And so the altar and the flaming heart are symbolic of devotion and of eternal love. And the flowing robes, which in fact leave the breast of one of these women exposed, are not contemporary fashions of the time, but they evoke the ancient past. And collectively, we can understand this as Sapphic imagery. So imagery referring to the Greek poet Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos, from which we get the modern term lesbian, some 2,500 years ago, and who is still famous for her homoerotic lyric verse.
So, how would one be able to tell that this was more than just a tribute to a famous poet?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And of course, are we layering our 21st century experiences and expectations onto this? Well, sorry, I just timed out, but I'm back. Sappho's poetry was well known during the 18th and 19th century when this wine glass was decorated. And Sapphic imagery was quite often used to symbolize both, as you say, female literary genius, female literary talent, and also female homoeroticism. And there were several high-profile writers in the Netherlands during this time, female writers, gay female writers, whose printed works contained frontispieces with illustrations of Sapphic imagery, of women interacting in very similar ways to these. But the key is, in these instances, these women also had the attributes of poets. So they carried lyres, or they had crowns of laurel wreaths, which identified them as poets. Here, the figures in this engraving have no such attribute, and the banderole underneath saying Vriendschap is actually directing our attention to the relationship between the women rather than necessarily any of their other accomplishments.
So you have two women here, and would this have been different from other kinds of goblets that, you know, what is, I mean, I'm sure, were there others like this out in the world at this time?
Well, as far as I know, it's unique. Friendship was a very, very common theme on wine glasses in the Netherlands at the time. The Netherlands was driven by mercantilism. Its society was structured around guilds, and it was notorious for its drinking culture, as Anna might speak to in a bit. So toasting to friendship and to either business alliances or familial alliances, the birth of a child, typically a son, these things were typically often acknowledged on wine glasses, but the relationship between, the romantic relationship between same-sex couples is very unusual.
So you mentioned guilds. Were there glass guilds? What do we know about the artist who made this?
We know very little about the artist who decorated this. It is signed L. Adams, and it's one of a group of wine glasses that is signed by the same engraver. But we know that we don't even know their gender. So we know that they were operating in the early 1800s, which enables us to date this goblet. But we don't really know very much more than that. But this is unusual among all the other examples of their work.
Okay, great. So I want to switch to Anna for a bit. You also wanted to talk about a wine glass, and like the museum's wine glass, it also depicts a couple. So tell us what's happening in this scene.
Yes, this is also a friendship goblet. On the other side of the glass of the bowl that we see now, we see glasie van vriendschap, which means a glass of friendship, which you thought already, probably. But here we see the biblical figures David and Jonathan that kiss and embrace each other because they have to say farewell. And it's written beneath the depiction, to the left David and to the right Jonathan. And of course, we all know the story of the adolescent David defeating the Philistine giant Goliath. David catapulted a stone to his head and cut Goliath's head off with the giant's own sword. And what happened after this famous story is much less known, because after his victory, David goes to the King Saul, and he stood next to the warlord Jonathan. And Jonathan was one of Saul's children. And immediately Jonathan feels a strong friendship for David and gives him his whole armor, including his sword. So he is disarmed by David. Then David becomes a warlord as well, and he is very successful, and he is even more successful than Saul. And then Saul becomes very jealous and wants to have him killed. And Jonathan stands up against his father, and he rescues David and helps him to escape. And then they have to say goodbye forever. And that is the moment that the engraver depicted on the glass. They will not see each other again. And Jonathan and his father, King Saul, will be killed in a battle. And as Kate already said, a toast to friendship was very important. It was the most important toast in the Dutch Republic. And a series of toasts would end with a toast to friendship. And this was one of the ways the toast was depicted.
Okay. So we see some commonalities with two goblets from two different times. So the scenes look a little bit different, one glass to the other. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, maybe we should. I would like to tell a little bit more about the first goblet that we saw. Is that possible?
Please.
Yeah. Yes, here this. Yeah, I would like to tell about. Yes, normally David and Jonathan. How shall I start? Well, I found a small group of goblets that are of David and Jonathan that are a little bit different from the others. And I started my research because I saw so many goblets with David and Jonathan where they kissed each other and embraced each other. And of course, I start to read the Bible. And when you see the story, the Bible, it's very clear that relationship looks rather love than friendship. And David's beauty is emphasized several times, for example. And there's this dramatic farewell when they fall to the ground and they weep and they embrace each other. They don't have control about themselves anymore. And also after when David hears that Saul and Jonathan are dead, that they were both killed, he writes a lamentation, or he sings. And I would like to read that to you because there's a very remarkable sentence in this lamentation. David says to Jonathan, "Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." And today, many people think that this relationship was a homosexual relationship. So I started studying and reading about homosexuality in the Dutch Republic in the 18th century. And there's fantastic research has been done in this field. And I found out that it was forbidden to be homosexual in the 18th century. And they had hidden symbols because they were threatened so much. And when a man was attracted to another man, he could step upon the foot of the other man, and they would look each other in the eye. That's really emphasized. And then they could decide whether to go to a public toilet, maybe together. And all these toilets had their own names. So between this group of men. And this goblet that we see here, it shows that Jonathan stands with his foot on the foot of David. So here we can see clearly that this might be an invitation for, that this is more than friendship, this might be an invitation for sex.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, you mentioned the risk involved in being homosexual at this time, where's death for men. Kit, would women who toasted their love with this wine glass have faced the same risks?
It was slightly different for women in that it was same-sex female relationships were not considered public offences as male relationships were. But if two women attempted to marry, then they could be prosecuted for fraud, and that did happen. So women could live together. It was more respectable for women. It was easier for women to live together in certain social hierarchies. Female love wasn't as threatening to the patriarchy as male love. Female love is motherly tenderness, is dutiful. I'm saying all this in quotation marks. So there was a space in patriarchal society for women to cohabit, and that could be almost intellectualized into this kind of sapphic paradigm, which is what we see on the museum's glass.
Great. It's interesting to think about the changes over time and the changes from place to place of ways that people, homosexual people or LGBTQ people, we call today, would find ways to connect with each other and learn how to operate within the systems they inherited when they were born. Andy, a lot of your work considers queer culture's relationship to symbol and code closer to our time. Do any of Anna's and Kit's thoughts resonate with what you see happening with queer signaling today?
Yeah, thank you first of all, for having me. And it's so great to hear Anna and Kit talk about these goblets, which are fascinating to me. I'm going to dislocate us a little bit geographically and temporally, and maybe talk a little bit about kind of what queer signaling looked like around the time of liberation, of gay liberation in the United States, which is, around the time of the Stonewall riots in the late 1960s. So to maybe continue on the thread of sapphic love, what I'm showing you here is a magazine cover from not the first lesbian magazine in the United States. It's actually the second, but it's the first kind of widely distributed magazine in the United States. It's a publication called The Ladder, and it was developed by 2 women and a group of other women. The 2 women are Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. And they founded an organization called the Daughters of Bilitis. And even the name is kind of a code. And to kind of continue on with the Sappho references, there's actually a book of poetry that imagines Sappho's lover in 18th century France, and it was called Songs of Bilitis. And so the group's name is actually based on kind of this imagined female lover of Sappho. But what I'm showing you on the cover here are a couple things. One is the illustration itself, which shows a couple, maybe kind of visually male and female, although maybe androgynous, climbing a ladder into the sky. And then in the corner, there's this weird symbol, which I've kind of blown up for you on the right. And it's 2 exclamation points with the text qui vive, which is kind of shorthand for on alert. It actually is a sentry greeting. So qui vive is basically asking, like, to who, long live to who, like whose side are you on, essentially. So this becomes a way that some of the earliest lesbians in the group Daughters of Bilitis would identify each other with this little kind of signifier and symbol. It falls away after the group disbands and, you know, really hasn't kind of come up again, but queer people have consistently kind of created our own sign and signaling systems. A great example that's kind of post-liberation is the hanky code, which was a system for signaling sexual interest on the body. And it made use of an everyday item, which is the colored handkerchief. And depending on your placement of the handkerchief on the body in your back pocket or right pocket, you would indicate a number of sexual fetishes that you might be into, generally active or passive, dominant or submissive, in terms of your own interests. So to an outsider, outside of gay male communities in the early 70s, it just looks like you're wearing a handkerchief in your back pocket. But to those who are in the know, it can be a pretty complicated and maybe even kind of Baroque system for identifying each other. The image on the right is a photograph by Hal Fisher, who is a photographer who created this amazing set of photographs called Gay Semiotics. And here he's using kind of these anthropological kind of pointers to kind of remark on this kind of signaling system. And he says, you know, each handkerchief has its own meaning, but at the end of his little handwritten paragraph, it may be difficult to see, he also acknowledges that the handkerchief is also used to blow one's nose, right? So it's always about this kind of double-coded meanings and these uses that provide some kind of cover. And maybe to a kind of last, a last thing I'll mention is that even the symbols and signs that we've developed in the years since liberation that seem to be ubiquitous or even now cliche, something like the rainbow flag, it's worth kind of thinking about why those symbols also carry importance today. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see 2 images. One is of an image of Sarah Hagazi, who is an Egyptian woman who displayed the rainbow flag at a Mashru Leila concert in Cairo in 2017, for which she was imprisoned and tortured and then eventually exiled to Canada, simply for being out and visible as a queer person. Her and her friend Ahmed Allah shared the same fate. And I bring Sarah Hagazi up, and you might have heard her name because unfortunately, just this past week, she actually committed suicide in exile. Right, so sign systems, signaling systems are not just, I think, kind of clever semiotics. They're also very much tied to kind of livelihoods of queer people. And the last image that I'll show you is the one on the right, which is a neon work by the Dine artist Demian Dinayasha. And the text of the neon says, "Every American flag is a warning sign." And the reason I included this is I want to kind of like twist this conversation a little bit and kind of maybe suggest that there's a corollary to signaling systems that might be hidden, which is that there are often kind of queer ways of reading mainstream signals and symbols, right? So for Dimi and Dina Yaja, who is both indigenous and queer, they are kind of rereading the American flag, this symbol of national patrimony and nation. And here they read it as a warning sign, as something to be wary of, as something to be careful of, not something to embrace, right? So there's both the queer signaling systems that we develop as community, but also the ways in which we read the signals and symbols of others and kind of reframe and reimagine those.
So I'm curious, tell me a little bit about the process of that phenomenon you just talked about. So yeah, the idea that there are these things out there in our culture already, but also like the codes that we were looking at earlier, they needed to use something familiar to communicate. It sounds like some people have taken the flag and felt like it was communicating to them in a symbolic way beyond.
That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you know, that kind of operation that I just kind of ended with is what we would kind of maybe refer to as like queering a symbol or indigenizing a symbol. In Dimi and Dina Yaja's case, obviously, it's both an indigenous critique and a queer critique of American nationalism, right? But there's a way of taking things from popular culture and kind of repurposing them and reimagining them to speak to queer perspectives, LGBTQ perspectives, in a way, you know, that might be akin to a kind of overtly queer or maybe covertly queer reading of, say, the David and Jonathan story, or even Sappho's poetry, which is suffused with kind of lesbian erotics, but certainly there have been those who have made the argument that Sappho was not a lesbian as such, and all of that kind of good stuff. So I think that there's a way to think about both kind of what is a queer sign or symbol, but also like how do queer people take signs and symbols that are nominally not queer and kind of make them as such.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of sort of what I call, and what I hear other people call, kind of cultural dog whistles that other people use. Like for me, a personal one is the word heritage when it's used in a political or religious context. Mm-hmm. I immediately translate that to mean family's not like mine.
Right.
You know, so it's sort of a two-way street in a way, in a number of ways. What parts of the world, you mentioned Egypt, what parts of the world still consider symbols, and how are they used today? You kind of talked a little bit about that, but do you see any kind of trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've noticed in my own research, which is largely around kind of LGBTQ design in the post-liberation era, is that from the local to the national, even to the international, queer people have always been creating their own kind of systems for signaling to each other, right? When you're in an oppressive or repressive context, as both Kit and Anna were speaking to, right? One of the things that you have to do is kind of veil or code your communication to find similars, you know, if in fact that is what's going on with some of the earlier kind of objects that we were discussing, right? So I have no doubt that there are a broad variety of signaling systems that people use to identify each other as queer people. But what's interesting to me is that the rainbow flag at this point has become something like the international symbol for LGBTQ kind of politics, kind of painted with a broad brush. And that's really fascinating in some ways because it comes out of a really specific time and place, which is San Francisco in the 70s, right? And it's related to particular cultures and to particular people. And now it's kind of become this much broader and bigger symbol that people have invested a lot of energy into, right? One that's always changing. So on the one hand, I'm sure that if you looked around the world, you would find localized systems for where queer people were able to find each other and locate each other through visual semiotics, essentially. But on the other hand, we live in a world that is globally connected, and one of the effects of that is that the rainbow flag has become a kind of de facto baseline symbol for LGBTQ rights internationally. Right,
and even that sort of is the shorthand for all of that. And then now there's an emerging group of flags that are, making an effort to be more inclusive of populations and communities that were sort of excluded from the liberation movement when it started. I have a question. I know, Kit, you and I have talked in the past about different ways people would connect, obviously, and we kind of know based on what Anna told us sort of the ways that they happened, but these seem like very prestige kind of oriented objects. I mean, it doesn't look to me, based on what I've seen in the collection, that this would have been anything but a fancy formal thing. Did status play a role in any of the things that you and Anna have researched over time?
Yeah, I think Anna will be able to shed light on this too with her research, but certainly my hypothesis with the Corning wine glass is that it is maybe connected to the female literary circle in the Netherlands at the time. There is one particular writer, and I must give a shout out here to Professor Susan Lancer at Brandeis University, who put me onto this, but Agja Deakin, and Anna, I'm sorry I butchered her name probably, who was a well-known writer, and also she lived with her partner Betje Wolf for several decades. But before Betje, she had another partner named Maria Bosch, and wrote openly about her love for Maria. And if I may read you a couple of lines.
Please.
These are obviously translated, you'll be pleased to hear. She writes, "Oh, the life of women friends who are parted is cruel, bitter, and broken-hearted. Let me live with my Maria as well I may. I'll wish no more, a friend of friends to whom I pray." And this, I mean, she is quite overt here about her love for Maria, but being in a kind of elite literary circle, she could intellectualize this, and people accepted it. But I think the flip side of that is that we can also distinguish at this time between sapphic love and tribadism. So, for example, just before this, a couple of decades earlier, Marie Antoinette was vilified with allegations of lesbianism or tribadism with the Princesse de Lamballe as evidence of her degenerate character. So yes, there was a space in elite circles for these sorts of female relationships, certainly, but they weren't necessarily to be taken for granted, I think.
And probably the fact that she was part of a ruling class with Marie, that might have played some role in kind of how they wanted to sort of rein her in.
Yeah, so they focused on the sex element of it more than the kind of the relationship. They focused on the threatening part. But I think Anna did a little more research into the identities of the sorts of men who were known to operate in these sort of gay networks. And
Anna, would you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, in the men in 1730, there was found a network in the Netherlands of men that had sex with other men, and these came from all layers of the society, and they were spread over the whole country. And this is the moment that homophobia started in the Netherlands. So from this, before 1730, for example, the death sentence was not executed very often, and there were all kinds of sex that were forbidden, and this was called by one name, sodomie. And after 1730, there was a special anxiety for these homosexual men. So after this, I think it's about 60 times that the death sentence was executed, and now there's also a monument for this, what happened in Utrecht, and the change of time and how it was perceived, the homosexuality after 1730 in the Netherlands. Yeah, But these glasses, like what we see here, this is also a good example of Jonathan standing on the foot of David. And also we see his attributes. Jonathan has here as an attribute the bow and an arrow. And here the arrow, they play a role in how he helped to escape David. And here it's very clear that this is a erotical symbol. It is a phallus symbol, this arrow here. But these goblets, so this is a very important goblet in the research. These goblets were for the elite, for the Dutch elite. But also the Dutch elite was not safe. In 1730, many men of the Dutch elite fled from the country, or they married to be safe. So, yeah.
Interesting. Wow. I kind of want us to shift a little bit towards our audience. We've got some really good questions that are coming in. So if you would, let me kind of go back to our chat and kind of articulate some of these, and maybe whoever can answer will answer. So the maker, this is from Neil Guthrie, the maker of the sapphire glass sounds English. Were there many English craftsmen in Holland, and are signatures seen much on glass in this period? Could the David and Jonathan glass be associated with a gay drinking club?
I don't know if any of the David and Jonathan, your Dutch goblets are signed, Anna. But we also discovered, you and I, that, well, you pointed out this week, looking at our online catalogue, that we have a German David and Jonathan wine goblet and cover in the Corning collection with German inscription on. So it came from a very different geographic location. As for L. Adams, there are some Dutch engravers sign their work, but it's usually the very, very finest, and they are quite rare. So the other goblets signed by L. Adams depict sort of a pastoral, rural scenes, as far as I know. Anna, you've looked into it more than I have.
Yes, he's a Dutch engraver, I think, because I studied his oeuvre, and it's merely Dutch. There's one inscription in English, but Adams is also a Dutch name. We say Adam and Eva. I mean, it's nearly the same. It could be it's a Dutch name as well. He also made very interesting and complex goblets with, for example, yes, in help me even. Load it's a belief. Masonry, yeah, a masonry goblet. They're always very simple, but this is very complex. It seems as he might have been a member of a masonry community, or yes. So it's a very interesting engraver, and he is signed very modestly. You nearly cannot read his signature.
This is a related question. So all of these goblets are Dutch, but would this form of coding have been common in other countries too? You run across anything of that might answer that in your research?
Yeah, I just found out this week about the goblet in the Corning Museum of Glass with Jonathan's foot on the foot of David from a German background. So this is completely new to me because I didn't know German goblets with the same depiction. I know that this foot on foot was typical for the Netherlands, and it came from the scene of the prostitutes, because prostitutes were not really in the community as well, just like homosexuals. They were like band together, or they found each other in the streets. So it seems that their signals would have been alike, or maybe the same or much alike. The foot seems to be a symbol of, might be sex, because it seems to be the lowest of physical, your physique. If you would give them a range, they would be the lowest, the foot. So sexual. So it would be sexual. Yeah.
So just so I understand it, so it's the sexual nature of it kind of would represent perhaps the ranking of kind of physical relationships, but it also relates to where it's located on the body. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, it's the foot is especially good to make a sign like this. Yeah. So
this I'd be interested in hearing from Andy on this question too. Is there a difference in class between the signs we see historically versus the more contemporary hanky codes? And so Andy, maybe we can start with you. Does class play a role in the hanky code?
Yeah, but in the other way, right? Because the hanky is a working class object, right? So it's really kind of, it's made for folks who work in situations where they may have to kind of clean themselves or wipe their hands off, right? So it's a useful piece of costume, essentially, right? Which then gets kind of appropriated and used in this other way. So I think, yeah, class has a lot to do with kind of these signaling systems, but it's not necessarily kind of the class of an aristocracy, but I think more of a working class is what we see in the case of the hanky code, at least. I actually had a question. I had a question for Anna, which is, what is the text on the goblets? I mean, what does the text read on the goblets?
The first goblet that we saw is a glasie van vriendschap, which means a glass of friendship. But often we also see friendship and love. So then David and Jonathan, and then friendship and love. So that's quite open, the word love. So probably this has a meaning like friendship as well, because otherwise you could not write that on a goblet, I think, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Andy, there's a related, oh, sorry, go ahead, Anna.
Well, this is all, friendship and love, sincere friendship, loyal friendship, and they refer sometimes to salt. You can't live without salt, like you can't live without friends. So there's all kinds of inscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Anna, or Andy, actually, mm-hmm. A question came in from our audience. Is there anything to suggest that people of a lower class had their own symbols?
Yeah, I mean, class is really one of the great, at least in US-based kind of LGBTQ history, class is one of the great kind of underexplored kind of features of LGBTQ identity. There are certainly people who have worked on class and really written quite a bit about it, but in terms of kind of the signaling systems or the sign systems, I do think that there is a kind of more openness to who had access to certain kind of sign signals of LGBTQ life. It may have played a role in terms of who might have been, say, for example, in Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons' circle, right, which was kind of which was squarely middle class, right? So my guess is that the Daughters of Bilitis, although I don't know this for certain, but my educated guess would be that it's not super variegated in terms of class and class experience. But really, class in terms of queer symbology today certainly comes into it, but it's not, I don't see it as really a defining feature as much as something like visibility is, right? Like how or why things are visible is much more kind of closer to the surface with a lot of kind of contemporary queer symbols and signs.
Thanks. We've got quite great questions, but I actually would love to hear from Anna and Kit about an answer to this question as well. Did members of the lower class have their own set of symbols, or did they just share these with other classes?
Well, I think just like so much that relates to the lives of poorer classes, we just don't have the material. The material evidence doesn't survive. We only kind of have these sort of segues into their lives when they crossed with the lives of the elite. Like I think in Anna's example of the uncovering of this network in Utrecht, that it encompassed, in that case, it was a cross-class phenomenon, and so there were very wealthy members of society, but also poorer members. But how people communicated with one another in non-elite circles is generally a mystery. How they live generally is a mystery.
We just don't have the physical information that would be required to answer that question. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. We can assume that they shared the codes, and that of course there were queer communities in all social classes, but we don't have the material evidence necessarily.
The importance of research. This relates to, or goes to Andy, I think. How do these goblets as queer signifiers strike Andy? Is there anything about the symbols and their relationship to the mouth or foot, as we talked, both goblets and hankies, that add to their symbolic power?
Yeah, I mean, to me, what's interesting is that the goblets seem to engage in a set of historical kind of reference points that get kind of reused over and over and over again in kind of queer letters and life, right? So the David and Jonathan thing is not exclusive to these goblets. I mean, you can find poets kind of making the same conjunction, same with Sappho, right? So I think like there's a way in which kind of these historical or biblical relationships become codes themselves, much, you know, and have some kind of staying power. But I like the idea. I mean, what I was going to say to the previous question was that part of the reason, and I think Kit, your answer is helping me to kind of clarify this. Part of the reason why it's hard to talk about working class or poorer class queer communities is because, of course, as you said, Kit, the material evidence doesn't kind of exist in the same way. But, you know, a lot of queer community is built on performance too, right? So, you know, you signal not only with objects, but with your body. And so one of the things that is really fascinating with these goblets to me, these wine glasses to me, is that they're meant to be performed with the body. They're meant to be performed in ritual, as Anna was saying, right? They're meant to be kind of shared and part of a kind of process of performance. Right. So there's also a kind of history of queer performance and signaling that we could be talking about alongside these objects as well. Like I'm really interested in what these wine glasses look like when they're filled with wine, right? Like kind of like how that changes the image and the materiality. And like the questioner was saying, like what it might have to do with the mouth as like a site of enactment, right? So I think like there's a lot more kind of exploring to do also with material culture in relation to the body and the performance of the body, right?
Wow, I love the layers of this. I want to move back up our question list and pose this one. Is it possible to know if the glassmakers were aware of the symbolism of the commission, or was their unawareness a way to ensure their discretion?
Yeah, I think for the 18th century goblets, they were not aware of the symbol. I think it was impossible to tell that to a glass engraver. Yeah, I think it was a secret for the glass engraver as well. And with wine, the goblet looks stunning. You should pour white wine in it.
Oh, I'm so glad you've seen it.
It comes to life. It's incredible. It's really the Dutch goblets especially, because they only have a decoration on one side of the bowl, and then it's the wine works like a magnifying glass, and it's perfect.
Love it.
I would echo that and say that there was certainly for the Corning wine glass, there were engravings that the glass engraver could have consulted as a source or been instructed to consult without the kind of the motivation ever being made explicit. And also in the museum, we display these against a black background to bring out the engraving, to make it visible. So they are kind of almost secret objects in that their messaging coding only really becomes apparent when they're filled with liquid being used by the participants of this drinking ritual. They are quite magical in that respect.
So we probably have time for one question, and I know somebody is interested in knowing more about how Anna got into this. If that person will, I don't know how we can. Kim, can you help figure out how we can get that person the answer? But I did want to ask this one. There are two questions. One is there a possibility that the friendship toast itself came from the queer community and went outward?
This is a question for me. I think it's no, the toast to friendship is as old as alcohol, I think. I think when you drink wine, you go to another state of being, and it's like smoking a pipe for peace. It's a special moment, and you make a wish. You make your friendship bigger, or you start your friendship with a toast. I just found a quotation. It's from antiquity that a woman holding a goblet in her hand is a symbol of friendship. And I found an English description of this picture, and it says, "The glass itself is a token of friendship." So the friendship and goblets are, they are combined already for many, many years.
Great. Before, I'm gonna ask Kit this question because it really does probably go to him, but I don't know that we'll be able to give too much of an answer. But could the museum grow its collection of these symbolic pieces, either old or new?
I think, as we discovered last week with the discovery as we uncovered the David and Jonathan German goblet, we probably could uncover more within the collection as it stands. It seems it's a course of inquiry that we really haven't embarked on in any great depth. So it's very exciting to be at this kind of starting point. So I'm optimistic that we could grow this story one way or another.
Great. Well, we've reached the end of our time together, so I want to thank our guests. This has been such a great discussion, and I hope everyone watching it at home enjoyed it as much as I did. The episode of Connected by Glass will be added to our YouTube channel, along with all previous episodes featuring wildly different topics such as fiber optics, NASCAR's Glass Trophy, and the Netflix series Blown Away, and more. If you're enjoying Connected by Glass, please consider supporting our museum so we can continue to bring you compelling content. We'll be back with another episode of Connected by Glass soon. Look for more details on our social media in the near future. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.